The elevator doors opened on the 40th floor, and the whole room shifted. Not loudly. Not with any announcement. It was the kind of shift that happens when someone powerful walks into a space. A subtle tightening of the air, a straightening of backs, a dropping of voices. The woman who stepped out was dressed in a charcoal gray suit that fit her like it had been sewn directly onto her skin. Her heels made no hurry on the marble floor. Her eyes were steady, dark, and completely unafraid. Her name was Sandra Cole. And every person in that room knew it. Hello family, welcome back. Please hit subscribe and give this video a thumbs up. It really supports our channel. Don't forget to share with your friends and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new story. And please tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Now sit back, relax, and enjoy the story. Sandra was 31 years old and the founder of Bridge Tech, the fastest growing software company in West Africa. 3 years in a row, her face had appeared on the cover of business magazines. She had been called brilliant, ruthless, visionary, and cold, sometimes all in the same sentence. She did not mind. She had been called worse things by people who mattered more. She crossed the room to the long conference table, set her leather folder down, and looked at the 3 people already seated. An older man in a navy suit. A woman beside him, fingers laced together tightly, pearls at her throat. And a younger man, tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of face that had clearly once been soft and was now hardened by years of trying to hold something together. Sandra looked at all 3 of them. Then her eyes landed on the younger man and stayed there. His name was David Cole. He did not share her last name by coincidence. They had been married once, briefly, disastrously, to other people. His last name and hers were the same only because Lagos was a small world dressed up in a big city's clothing. She had noticed the name on the meeting request and told herself it meant nothing. But that face was not nothing. David was staring at the table, distracted, his jaw tight. He had not looked up when she entered. The older man, his father, Gerald Cole, leaned forward with the rehearsed smile of someone about to ask a very large favor. "Miss Sandra," Gerald began, "we appreciate you making time." Sandra did not answer immediately. She was still watching David. Somewhere deep in the back of her mind, past the boardrooms and the balance sheets and the decade of grinding silence, a door cracked open. Behind it was a boy of 10, laughing under a cashew tree in the backyard of a yellow house in Ibadan. Behind it was a summer that smelled like rain and ripe fruit. Behind it was a promise spoken in the serious, unbreakable voice that only children use. "I'll find you again. No matter what." David finally looked up. Their eyes met. Something moved across his face, fast, like a cloud shadow crossing open land. He blinked. He frowned slightly. He looked at her the way a man looks at something his mind recognizes before his memory does. Sandra held his gaze for exactly 3 seconds. Then she opened her folder and said, "Let's begin." But her hands, hidden beneath the table, were trembling. David Cole was 7 years old the first time he climbed the cashew tree. It was a Saturday morning in Ibadan, the kind that arrived slowly, wrapped in soft light and the smell of wet earth from the night's rain. The tree stood at the far end of the compound behind his family's house on a Delhi street, wide-trunked, ancient, with branches that spread out like arms welcoming everyone underneath them. David had lived in that house his whole short life. He knew every corner of it. But the tree was his favorite place in the world. He was halfway up the trunk, his school shoes already ruined with bark stains, when he heard a sound below him. A small voice. Quiet but firm. "You're going to fall." He looked down. Standing at the base of the tree was a little girl. She could not have been more than 5 years old. She was thin, with wide serious eyes and 2 untidy plaits on either side of her head. Her dress was faded pink, slightly too big for her, the hem touching her ankles. He had never seen her before. "I won't fall," David said confidently. "You will," she said, with the calm certainty of someone reporting the weather. "Your left foot is on a dead branch." David looked down at his left foot. She was right. He shifted quickly, heart hammering, and grabbed a stronger branch above him. He climbed back down slowly, trying to look like that had been the plan all along. The girl was still standing there when he landed, arms folded, watching him without judgment. "I'm David," he said. "Sandra," she replied. That was how it started. Sandra lived 2 streets away in a small unpainted house with her mother, a quiet woman who sold boiled groundnuts by the roadside every morning. They had very little. David's family had more than enough. His father Gerald owned a textile distribution company that supplied fabric to shops across Oyo State. They had 2 cars, a generator that never ran out of fuel, and a housegirl who made breakfast every day. None of that mattered under the cashew tree. Under the tree, David and Sandra were simply two children who had found each other. They met there every Saturday. They talked about everything: school, dreams, the things they were afraid of, the people they wanted to become. Sandra wanted to build things. Machines, she said, or maybe computers. Something that would make people's lives easier. David wanted to be important. He wasn't sure how yet, but he wanted people to respect his name. Sandra laughed at that, not cruelly but warmly. Names don't make people respect you, she said. What you do makes them respect you. David thought about that for a long time. As the weeks turned into months, the friendship became something neither of them had words for. David began saving the best cashew fruits for Sandra. Sandra began helping David with his mathematics homework spread across the flat rock beneath the tree. They argued, laughed, and sat in comfortable silence on afternoons when words felt unnecessary. One evening, as the sun melted into the rooftops of Ibadan, Sandra said quietly, "What if they separate us one day?" David looked at her. "Who would do that?" She shrugged, picking at the grass. "People do things." He reached out his small hand and hooked his little finger around hers. "I'll find you again," he said. "No matter what. I promise." Sandra looked at their locked fingers for a moment. Then she nodded once, slowly, like she was signing a document. Neither of them knew, sitting under that tree in the golden evening light of Ibadan, that they had less than 3 months left. The morning Gerald Cole decided to move his family to Lagos, he did not ask anyone's opinion. He announced it at breakfast the way he announced most things, calmly, finally, like a judge reading a verdict. The company was expanding. There was a bigger office waiting in Lagos Island. The children would go to better schools. The family would live in a better neighborhood. It was not a discussion. It was a decision. David sat at the table and said nothing. He was 10 years old, but he understood enough. He understood that Lagos meant leaving Ibadan, leaving Adelik Street, leaving the cashew tree, leaving Sandra. That afternoon he ran to the tree. Sandra was already there, sitting on the flat rock with her knees pulled to her chest. Somehow she already knew, the way children in close neighborhoods always know things before they are told. Her eyes were dry, but her face was doing something complicated, the way a face does when a person is working very hard not to cry. David sat beside her and said nothing for a long time. "When?" Sandra asked. 3 weeks, he said. She nodded slowly and looked at the ground. David wanted to say something that would fix it. He searched his 10-year-old mind for the right words and found none that were big enough. So he did the only thing he could think of. He reached into the pocket of his shorts and pulled out a small yellow cashew fruit he had picked that morning, saving it for her the way he always did. He placed it in her palm. Sandra stared at it. Then something in her face broke, quietly, like a thin piece of glass. "It's not fair," she whispered. "I know," he said. They sat under the tree until the evening insects began to sing. Before Sandra left that day, David grabbed her little finger with his. "Remember what I said," he told her, his voice steady, his eyes serious. "I'll find you again. No matter what. That doesn't change." Sandra looked at him for a long moment. "Promise me properly." "I promise." She held his gaze, then nodded and walked away down the dusty path without looking back. David watched her until she disappeared around the corner. 3 weeks later, the Cole family loaded their belongings into a truck and drove out of Ibadan in the early morning before the city fully woke up. David sat in the back seat with his face pressed against the window, watching the familiar streets slide past. He watched the turn that led to Adelik Street. He watched it until it disappeared behind them. Nobody in the car spoke to him. His mother was on her phone. His father was already thinking about Lagos. Lagos was everything Ibadan was not. Louder, faster, brighter, more brutal. Their new house in Lekki was large and modern, with a swimming pool in the back and a security gate that hummed when it opened. David's new school had an Olympic-size field and students who wore imported trainers and spoke English with careful accents. He was miserable. Not in the loud, obvious way. In the quiet, hollowed-out way that nobody notices because the person is still eating and still sleeping and still answering when spoken to. He smiled when required. He made acquaintances, not friends. He carried the promise like a stone in his chest, heavy but his. Meanwhile, Gerald and his wife Patricia began, slowly and deliberately, to reshape their son. Better friends, better circles, better futures. Patricia especially was focused. She had seen the way David used to talk about that girl from 2 streets away, the groundnut seller's daughter, and she had made a private decision the day they left Ibadan that that chapter was permanently closed. She never said it out loud. She didn't have to. She just made sure Lagos filled every space where Ibadan used to live. But there are some things a mother's careful hands cannot reach. And David Cole, now enrolled in one of Lagos's finest schools, still fell asleep some nights thinking about a faded pink dress, a flat rock, and a little girl who had told him he was going to fall before he even knew it himself. She had been right about the branch. He was beginning to think she had been right about everything. Sandra did not cry after David left. Not that morning, not that week, not ever, at least not where anyone could see her. She was 5 years old when they met and 8 years old when he disappeared, and somewhere in those 3 years she had learned something important from watching her mother. She had learned that tears were expensive. That a person with very little could not afford to spend energy on things they could not change. So she folded the grief quietly and placed it somewhere deep, and then she went back to school. Her mother, Grace, woke up every morning at 5 o'clock. She tied her wrapper, packed her groundnuts into a wide enamel tray, balanced it on her head, and walked 40 minutes to her spot by the roadside. She came home every evening smelling like smoke and salt, counted her small earnings on the kitchen table, and still somehow made sure Sandra had a pencil and a notebook for the next day. Sandra watched all of this, every single day. And it built something inside her that no classroom could have taught. She became serious about school the way some children become serious about survival. Because for Sandra they were the same thing. She sat at the front of every class. She asked questions that made her teachers pause. She borrowed textbooks from classmates who had extras and returned them with the pages more worn than when she received them, because she had read each one 3 times. By the time she was 12, her mathematics teacher told Grace that Sandra was the most gifted student he had taught in 20 years. Grace cried that evening. Quietly at the kitchen table after Sandra had gone to bed. Happy tears, the kind she allowed herself once in a while. Sandra heard her through the thin wall and said nothing. She just stared at the ceiling in the dark and made herself a promise. Not out loud. Not with a hooked finger. Just a silent, iron commitment in the privacy of her own chest. I will build something. Something real. Something that cannot be taken. The years moved. Sandra won a scholarship to a federal government school in Ibadan. Then another scholarship to study computer science at the University of Lagos. She arrived in Lagos at 18 with one bag, a second-hand laptop her teacher had helped her buy, and an attention to detail that made her classmates quietly uncomfortable. Lagos did not impress her. It intimidated her, yes. The noise, the speed, the way the city seemed to be always running toward something just out of reach. But she did not let it swallow her. She studied while others partied. She built small software applications in her hostel room at night, selling them cheaply to small businesses around campus just to see if they worked in the real world. They worked. By her final year, a technology incubator in Victoria Island offered her a seat in their startup program. She deferred her youth service, packed her single bag again, and moved into the incubator's shared workspace. She named her company BridgeTech. The name meant something personal. A bridge was what you built when there was a gap too wide to jump. Sandra had spent her whole life staring at gaps, between her life and a better one, between where she was and where she needed to be. She understood bridges better than most people understood comfort. BridgeTech started with 3 clients and 1 employee, Sandra herself. Within 2 years it had 40 clients. Within 5, it had offices on 3 floors of a building in Lagos Island, a staff of 90, and a reputation that made bigger, older companies nervous. Sandra was 30 years old and had not stopped moving since she was 8. She had also never gone back to Ibadan. Not because she was afraid, but because she had made a decision early: look forward, not back. The past was a place you visited only long enough to understand it, then you left it where it belonged. But the past, it turns out, does not always wait politely to be visited. Sometimes it walks into your boardroom and sits across the table from you and looks at you with eyes you last saw under a cashew tree 22 years ago. And no amount of discipline or success or careful forward-looking prepares you for that. Not even Sandra Cole. The meeting should have lasted 45 minutes. It lasted 12. Gerald Cole spread the documents across the conference table with the practiced confidence of a man who had once been powerful and had not yet fully accepted that he no longer was. Cole Fabrics, the textile company he had built over 30 years, was collapsing. A combination of bad investments, flooding in their Apapa warehouse, and 3 consecutive years of poor decisions had left the company bleeding from every direction. They needed a technology partner. Someone who could digitize their supply chain, rebuild their client management system, and restructure their distribution network before the whole thing went under completely. Their accountant had recommended BridgeTech. Gerald had agreed without researching further, because drowning men do not interrogate the rope. Sandra listened to everything without writing a single note. She already knew the details. Her team had prepared a full brief the moment the Cole name appeared in her appointment calendar. She had read it twice, set it down, walked to her office window, and stood there for a long time looking at the Lagos skyline without seeing any of it. Now she sat across from Gerald and Patricia Cole and their son, and she let Gerald finish his presentation before she spoke. Your supply chain has 4 critical gaps, she said simply. Your client database has not been updated since 2019. Your warehouse tracking is entirely manual. And your distribution contracts in 3 states have lapsed without renewal. Gerald blinked. You've reviewed our operations? I reviewed what was available, Sandra said. The rest I can see from what you've presented. Patricia Cole had been silent since the meeting began. She was a well-dressed woman with careful posture and the kind of controlled expression that came from decades of managing appearances. She was studying Sandra now with sharp, assessing eyes. Sandra felt the weight of that gaze and did not flinch. David had still not spoken. He sat slightly apart from his parents, his elbows on the table, his eyes moving between Sandra and the documents. He had the look of a man carrying guilt he had never properly set down. His company, a real estate firm he had built separately from his father's business, was stable, but he had poured significant personal funds into Cole Fabrics trying to save it. The weight of that showed in his face. We can help you, Sandra said finally, folding her hands. Bridgetech has restructured companies in worse condition than this. Gerald exhaled slowly. That is a relief to hear. However, Sandra said, I have one condition before we proceed. The room shifted. Gerald straightened. Patricia's eyes narrowed slightly. David looked up fully for the first time since the meeting began, and something in his expression changed. Not recognition yet, but the feeling just before recognition. The mind reaching for something it cannot quite touch. A condition? Gerald said carefully. Sandra looked directly at David when she spoke. There is something that belongs to me in Ibadan, she said. Something that was left unfinished a long time ago. Before I commit Bridgetech's resources to this partnership, I need the right person to go back and find it. Silence. David's brow pulled together slowly. I don't understand. Sandra held his gaze without blinking. Yes, you do, she said quietly. You just haven't let yourself remember yet. The color changed in David's face. Slowly, the way dawn changes a sky, not all at once but undeniably. His mouth opened slightly. His eyes searched her face with sudden, desperate attention, moving from her eyes to her jaw to the small details that time had rearranged but not erased. Patricia made a small sound beside him. Sure. Warning. But Sandra did not look at Patricia. She kept her eyes on David, steady and patient, the way a person waits who has already waited 22 years and knows that a few more seconds will not break them. David's voice, when it finally came, was barely above a whisper. Sandra? She said nothing. But for the first time since he walked into her boardroom, she smiled. David Cole drove to Ibadan alone. He did not tell his parents where he was going. He did not answer his father's calls or respond to his mother's messages that buzzed steadily against the car seat beside him. He just drove, with both hands on the wheel and the kind of silence around him that only exists when a person is finally moving toward something true. The Lagos-Ibadan expressway stretched out ahead of him in the early morning light. Other cars rushed past in both directions, carrying people toward their own urgent destinations. David barely saw them. His mind was somewhere else entirely, somewhere 22 years back in a compound on a Delhi street, where a boy with ruined school shoes had climbed a tree and nearly fallen. He had nearly fallen. She had warned him. He found a Delhi street without needing directions. The body remembers what the mind pretends to forget. He turned into the familiar road and felt something loosen in his chest, a knot so old he had stopped noticing it was there. The street was smaller than he remembered. The houses were older. But the feeling of the place was exactly the same, like a song you haven't heard in years that begins playing and your mouth already knows every word. He parked at the end of the compound and got out. The cashew tree was still there. He stopped walking when he saw it. He just stood at the edge of the compound and looked at it for a long moment. It was taller now, broader, the trunk thicker and deeply grooved with age. The same branches spread outward like arms. A few early cashew fruits hung in small clusters, pale yellow-green in the morning light. David walked toward it slowly. He placed his hand flat against the trunk, and the bark was rough and cool under his palm, and something moved through him that he had no name for. Not quite sadness. Not quite joy. Something that lived in the place where both of those things meet. He heard footsteps behind him. He turned. Sandra was standing at the entrance of the compound. She was not in her charcoal suit. She wore a simple white dress, her hair loose around her shoulders, and she looked so entirely like herself, not the CEO, not the woman from the boardroom, just Sandra, that David's throat tightened painfully. She had driven separately. She had known he would come. She had known because she knew him, had always known him, the way you know the people who were written into your life before you understood what life was. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. Then David said, "I should have found you sooner." Sandra walked slowly across the compound toward him. The morning birds were loud in the tree above them. The light was soft and golden the way Ibadan light always is in the early hours, unhurried and warm. "You found me," she said simply. "I never forgot," he said. "Not one day." Sandra stopped in front of him. She looked at his face the way she had looked at it across the boardroom table, carefully, completely, but without the armor this time. Without the folder and the steady hands and the controlled distance. "I built everything trying to prove something," she said quietly. "I told myself it was for me. For my mother. For every person who ever looked at my faded dress and decided I was less." She paused. "But some part of it was always for that boy who hooked his finger around mine and said he would find me." David reached out slowly and took her hand. She let him. They stood under the cashew tree for a long time, saying nothing because nothing needed to be said. The promise had been made in this exact spot, under these same branches, by two children who understood something about loyalty that most adults spend their whole lives trying to learn. Behind them, quiet footsteps entered the compound. Gerald and Patricia Cole had followed their son to Ibadan. They stood at the edge of the compound now, side by side, and they saw everything. The tree, their son, the woman he was holding hands with. Patricia's face was complicated. Gerald's was simply tired. Sandra looked at them over David's shoulder. She felt old anger rise briefly, then settle. She thought of her mother, Grace, still in Ibadan, healthy now and resting. The groundnut tray retired for 3 years since Sandra had bought her a small quiet house on a clean street. She thought of everything her mother had carried without complaint, and she understood that bitterness was a weight she simply refused to carry forward. She stepped gently away from David and walked toward his parents. Patricia opened her mouth. "You don't need to say anything," Sandra said quietly. "Neither do I." She glanced back at David, then at them. "Bridgetech will help Cole Fabrics. Not because of the past. Because it is the right thing to do." Gerald's eyes grew wet. He looked at the ground. Sandra extended her hand to Patricia. After a long, still moment, Patricia took it. 6 months later, Cole Fabrics was profitable again. The supply chain Sandra's team rebuilt reduced costs by 40%. New distribution contracts were signed across 5 states. Gerald Cole, in an interview with a business publication, credited Bridgetech entirely. He did not mention the rest of the story. Some things he had finally learned belonged only to the people who lived them. David proposed to Sandra on a quiet Sunday evening in Ibadan. Not in a restaurant. Not with a crowd watching. Just the two of them under the cashew tree, the same flat rock beneath their feet, the evening insects beginning their soft noise in the branches above. She said yes before he finished the question. Their wedding was held in the compound on Adelik Street, under the wide arms of the cashew tree that had stood there longer than either of them had been alive. Grace sat in the front row in a yellow dress and cried freely, because she had earned every tear. The tree was decorated with small warm lights that glowed as the sun went down over Ibadan. And under its branches, two people who had once been small and hopeful and achingly honest with each other stood together and proved that some promises, the ones made in complete sincerity, with nothing to gain and everything to feel, do not expire. They simply wait. We've come to the end of today's story. I hope it touched your heart. Thanks for watching and staying with us till the end. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories. See you in the next one. And tell us in the comments, where are you watching from?